I'm the HOA president. I can control the crowd my own way.
Ma'am, this is not your society.
The city street buzzed with purpose long before anything went sideways, the kind of energy that comes from people showing up because they actually care. Handmade signs bobbed above heads, cardboard and poster board marked with bold letters, slogans painted in uneven strokes. Chants rolled down the block in waves, not angry, not chaotic, just loud enough to be heard. Folks moved together, shoulder to shoulder, giving each other space while still holding the line. It was organized without being rigid, passionate without being reckless. Police officers stood off to the side in a loose formation, relaxed but alert, hands resting near their belts, eyes scanning calmly. They weren't directing anyone because they didn't need to. This was a permitted protest, planned out, coordinated, and running smooth. The crowd knew where to go. The officers knew when to step in and when to stay back. It was one of those rare moments where everything just worked. The narrator clocks it immediately. This is public space. A city street. First Amendment territory. Not a cul-de-sac. Not a subdivision loop. Not a place where neighborhood bylaws mean a damn thing. Whatever rules apply here come from permits and public law, not laminated HOA handbooks. And standing on the edge of it all, slightly out of rhythm with everyone else, was the woman who didn't seem to get that memo. She wore a bright blazer that looked more boardroom than street rally, clean and pressed like she'd dressed for a meeting, not a march. In her hand was a clipboard, gripped tight against her chest, pen clipped neatly at the top. She didn't chant. She didn't hold a sign. She didn't move with the crowd. She stood still, watching, eyes darting from person to person like she was evaluating something instead of witnessing it. At first, she blended into the background as just another onlooker. Protests attract all kinds of people and not everyone participates the same way. But while others watched with curiosity or solidarity, she watched with calculation. Her gaze lingered on spacing between protesters, the width of gaps, the way signs clustered together. She shifted her weight, frowned slightly, and glanced down at her clipboard like it held answers. People nearby assumed she was maybe part of the organizing team or a city volunteer. The clipboard gave her that vibe. In America, a clipboard is basically a fake badge. You hold one confidently enough and folks hesitate to question you. That hesitation bought her time. Chants grew louder, echoing off storefronts and traffic lights. A group near the front raised their signs higher, and the rhythm of the march tightened. Police stayed hands off, exchanging casual glances, comfortable with how things were going. Everything about the scene screamed lawful, peaceful, and intentional. She didn't join it. Instead, she stepped closer to the edge of the moving crowd, careful at first, like she was testing the water. She leaned slightly forward, scanning signs as they passed, lips pressed thin. Her blazer stood out more now, bright against the sea of hoodies, t-shirts, and worn jackets. Someone brushed past her shoulder accidentally and murmured a quick apology. She didn't respond. The narrator clocks her again. She has zero authority here. None. Not symbolic. Not implied. Not borrowed. She's just a person standing on a public street with a clipboard and a whole lot of misplaced confidence. She took another step forward, now inside the outer edge of the crowd, eyes moving faster. She looked down at the pavement, then back up at the spacing between people, then over at the officers like she was checking alignment. Her mouth tightened and she shook her head once, small but deliberate. A protester noticed her staring and gave her a confused look like, "You good?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised the clipboard slightly, pen still clipped as if she was about to start something official. The protester shrugged and turned back to the chant, assuming whatever this was, it wasn't about them. She paused near a cluster of signs, reading them carefully, then glanced back at the rest of the group. Her eyes narrowed. This wasn't curiosity. This was assessment. Like she was mentally rearranging people in her head. Police officers noticed her now too, not alarmed, just aware. They didn't move because she hadn't done anything yet. Standing around with a clipboard isn't illegal, no matter how weird the vibe is. They stayed relaxed, trusting the situation to self-correct. The crowd kept flowing, voices steady, movement coordinated. The purpose was clear. The energy was focused. And then she did something small that changed everything. She stepped fully into the lane of movement, forcing two protesters to slow down. She raised her hand slightly, palm out, not aggressively, just enough to interrupt. Her mouth opened like she was about to speak, then closed again as she looked around, checking whether anyone else was watching. The clipboard came off her chest and into her hands, ready. People around her stopped chanting for a second, confusion rippling outward. A couple protesters exchanged looks, eyebrows raised. One laughed quietly, thinking maybe this was a joke or some kind of organizer cue they missed. She didn't laugh back. She looked serious, focused, almost annoyed. The narrator doesn't need to spell it out. This is the moment. The exact second where observation turns into interference. Where someone with pretend power decides real-world rules aren't structured enough for her taste. She scanned the signs again, then the spacing, then the officers, like she was lining up chess pieces. Her pen slid free from the clip with a soft click that sounded way louder than it should have. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to insert herself where nobody asked her to be. And that's when she decided the protest needed structure. She chose her moment carefully, stepping in front of a single protester rather than addressing the crowd all at once. It was a guy holding a cardboard sign with thick marker lettering, mid-chant, clearly focused on the march and not expecting to be interrupted. She raised one finger politely, the universal signal for just a second, and waited until he paused. Her face was calm, almost pleasant, like she was about to ask for directions or the time. She spoke softly at first, explaining that she wasn't trying to shut anything down, just make things run more smoothly. The phrasing was intentional. Smoothly sounded harmless. Helpful even. She said the crowd flow wasn't really compliant with community standards and that it could become an issue if it stayed disorganized. The words felt out of place on a city street filled with chants and signs, but she delivered them like they were common sense. The protester blinked, genuinely confused, and glanced around like he was missing something obvious. He asked what standards she was talking about. She nodded patiently, like she'd expected the question, and explained that order mattered in shared spaces. She talked about designated spacing, how people should leave consistent gaps, and how approved routes existed for a reason. Each phrase came out smooth and rehearsed, like she'd said them 100 times before in meetings where people actually listened. He looked past her toward the rest of the crowd, then back at her, clearly trying to figure out if she was serious. She didn't raise her voice or act aggressive. She kept it polite, measured, almost corporate. That politeness threw him off. It's hard to argue with someone who sounds calm and confident, even when what they're saying makes no sense. Nearby protesters slowed their chanting, drawn in by the odd exchange. A woman holding a sign leaned closer, eyebrows raised. Another guy shook his head slightly, lips pressed together, but didn't say anything. Nobody wanted to blow up a peaceful protest over one weird interaction. The vibe stayed non-confrontational, but the confusion was spreading fast. Karen kept talking, explaining that approved routes helped prevent congestion and that people wandering out of formation could create issues later. She said later like it carried weight, like consequences were waiting just around the corner. The protester let out a short laugh, not mocking, just disbelieving, and said they were following the permit route. She waved that off gently, saying permits didn't replace standards. Police officers watched from a short distance away, hands still relaxed, posture neutral. They noticed the interaction but didn't step in. Nothing illegal was happening yet. It was just a woman talking, even if it was strange. Officers are trained not to jump into every odd exchange, especially at peaceful protests. They stayed put, eyes tracking the situation. The protester tried to disengage, saying he needed to keep moving. She stepped slightly to the side, still blocking him just enough to keep the conversation going. She reiterated that she was only trying to help maintain order. That word again. Order. It hung in the air heavier this time. Someone behind him muttered, "What is this lady even on about?" Another protester snorted quietly. Karen ignored them completely, focusing on her chosen audience. She nodded as she spoke, reinforcing her own points, clearly comfortable in this role. This wasn't impulsive. This was familiar territory for her. When the protester finally said they were fine as is and tried to step around her, she let him pass but watched him go with visible disapproval. That's when she pulled out the clipboard. The movement was smooth, practiced, like muscle memory kicking in. She flipped it open and glanced down, pen already in hand. The act of writing changed everything. Talking can be brushed off. Writing feels official. The pen scratched against paper, slow and deliberate, and a few people nearby leaned in to see what she was doing. She jotted something down, then looked up, scanning the crowd again like she was inventorying it. Protesters exchanged looks now, discomfort creeping in. One woman whispered, "Is she taking notes on us?" Another shrugged but didn't look convinced. Phones started coming out, not raised high yet, just angled enough to record. The situation still felt absurd, but the stakes had shifted. Karen moved a few steps down the line, stopping another protester and repeating the same calm explanation about flow and spacing. This time her tone was firmer, less friendly. She gestured vaguely at the crowd and then back at her clipboard as if the connection should be obvious. The protester listened, baffled but not hostile, then shook his head and walked away. She wrote again. More notes. More underlines. Each mark seemed to boost her confidence. Being ignored didn't slow her down. If anything, it reinforced her belief that she needed to document what she saw. She adjusted her stance, planted her feet, and looked around like she was overseeing a project. Officers continued to observe, brows furrowed now, clearly confused but still hands off. They weren't sure what authority she thought she had, but she hadn't crossed a line that required intervention yet. Protesters stayed calm, though the chanting had dropped to a murmur in her immediate area. Karen flipped to a fresh page, smoothing it out with her palm. She sighed loudly, like she was dealing with a mess she hadn't caused. The pen clicked again, sharp and final. People nearby felt it. The vibe shifted from weird to concerning. She looked up from the clipboard, eyes scanning the crowd with purpose, already deciding what to correct next. But she didn't stop there. She didn't waste time easing into the next move because once the clipboard was out, restraint was gone. She looked up from her notes and pointed at a cluster of signs near the front, saying those were not authorized. The word landed sharp and confusing, like she'd just accused cardboard and marker of breaking a rule. Protesters holding the signs froze, glancing at each other like they were waiting for a punchline that never came. She elaborated without being asked, explaining that signage needed to follow approved guidelines to avoid confusion. She said some messages disrupted cohesion and didn't align with acceptable presentation. The language sounded ripped straight from a meeting agenda, completely disconnected from the reality of a public protest. One protester laughed under his breath, then stopped when she didn't crack a smile. Karen stepped closer and gestured for a woman to move 2 feet to the left, explaining that spacing needed to be consistent. The woman looked down, then back up, clearly unsure if she was being pranked. Karen repeated the direction, slower this time, like she was dealing with someone who wasn't catching on. The chant nearby stumbled as people turned to see what was happening. She raised her voice just enough to cut through the rhythm, telling the group they needed to tighten formation. That interruption sucked the momentum right out of the chant, leaving an awkward gap where voices used to be. Protesters stared openly now, disbelief spreading. Someone muttered, "Is this for real?" Another shook their head and whispered, "This lady's trippin'." Karen didn't seem to notice the reaction. She was busy repositioning people like props, pointing where they should stand and how far apart they should be. She waved one protester forward, then stopped another from stepping back, contradicting herself without realizing it. The chaos she claimed to be fixing was entirely her creation. Phones came out quietly at first, not raised high, just angled to catch what was unfolding. Nobody announced they were recording. They didn't need to. The absurdity spoke for itself. Officers noticed the shift too, eyes narrowing slightly, but they still didn't intervene. She hadn't broken a law yet. She was just being wildly inappropriate. Karen interrupted another chant mid-syllable, raising her hand and saying she needed everyone to pause. The word pause echoed awkwardly. The chant died completely this time. Silence fell in her immediate area, thick and uncomfortable. She used the opening to lecture about order and how unregulated expression could lead to issues later. Later was doing a lot of work in her sentence. A protester finally asked who authorized her to make these calls. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said she was documenting non-compliance and that information would be reviewed. The vagueness made it worse. People exchanged looks that said, "Yeah, this is getting weird." Someone behind her snorted, "Who put her in charge?" She flipped the clipboard around slightly so people could see she was writing again. The pen moved fast now, lines scratched with purpose. She narrated part of it under her breath, mentioning spacing violations and unauthorized signage. Hearing herself say it out loud seemed to embolden her. Her posture straightened, shoulders back, chin lifted. Karen pointed at another sign and said that one needed to be lowered. The protester holding it stared at her, stunned, then laughed once, sharp and incredulous. She didn't laugh back. She told him failure to comply would be noted. That phrase landed hard. Not because it made sense but because it sounded like a threat dressed up as procedure. Phones were fully up now, screens glowing in broad daylight. No one bothered hiding it anymore. The crowd wasn't angry yet, just stunned into attention. Officers exchanged a look, clearly confused about what role she thought she was playing. They stayed put, watching closely, hands ready but still relaxed. Karen raised her voice again, louder than before, directing people to reposition and hold signs at uniform height. The chant tried to restart, but her voice cut through it again, killing the rhythm. Protesters groaned softly. The vibe shifted from focused to irritated. She said she was documenting non-compliance for follow-up. The phrase rolled off her tongue like she'd been waiting to use it all morning. She tapped the clipboard for emphasis, the sound sharp and deliberate. A woman near the edge whispered, "Oh, she's serious," and that realization rippled outward fast. Karen scanned the crowd like she was auditing it, eyes sharp, pen ready. She looked satisfied, like she'd finally taken control of something that had been bothering her. The protest, the crowd, the noise, all of it had become her problem to solve in her mind. That's when people realized she was serious. She took it a step further, planting herself sideways in the path of movement and waving her arm like she was guiding traffic at a school pickup. Her gestures were sharp and confident, palm out, then sweeping left, telling people where they should go without asking if they wanted to. Protesters slowed, then stopped, trying to figure out if this was some kind of organizer cue they'd missed. The sudden hesitation rippled backward through the crowd, breaking the easy forward flow that had held everything together. Karen leaned into it, pointing at the sidewalk and telling a small group they needed to shift over to maintain spacing. She spoke like this was obvious, like everyone else was being careless. When someone asked why, she answered that shared public spaces still required structure and oversight. The phrase sounded ridiculous out loud, but she said it with enough confidence to stall people in place. She moved again, stepping into a gap and closing it with her body, redirecting foot traffic with quick motions of her arm. People bumped shoulders, apologized to each other, and shot her looks that mixed annoyance with disbelief. The protest hadn't been chaotic before, but now it was starting to feel messy, and not in a good way. All of it traced back to her interference. She claimed HOA rules applied in shared public spaces, saying neighborhoods didn't stop at subdivision signs. That statement landed like a record scratch. A couple protesters laughed outright, thinking she had to be joking. She didn't crack a smile. She doubled down, insisting standards followed residents wherever they gathered. The logic was paper thin, but she delivered it like it was settled law. Chants tried to restart, voices rising together, but she talked over them, louder now, telling people to keep moving and not block intersections. Her voice cut through the rhythm, breaking it again. Protesters groaned softly. One guy muttered, "This lady is killing the vibe," and a few nearby nodded in agreement. Phones stayed up, recording steadily. People weren't hiding it anymore. The situation had crossed into something they wanted documented. Karen noticed the cameras and didn't back off. If anything, she straightened up more, shoulders squared, like attention validated her role. She pointed again, telling a group to spread out evenly. Someone asked who put her in charge. She ignored the question completely. She tried to redirect foot traffic down a side street, waving people that way even though the permit route was straight ahead. Protesters hesitated, confused, then stopped altogether. The forward momentum stalled and murmurs spread fast. This wasn't about disagreement anymore. It was about disruption. Karen raised her voice again, louder than before, insisting people follow direction. She said the word direction like it carried authority. The chant died completely this time, replaced by an awkward hush punctuated by distant city noise. The discomfort was visible now. People shifted their weight, crossed arms, and glanced around for someone official to step in. She pointed at the ground, telling people where to stand, correcting one person, then immediately correcting another in the opposite direction. Her instructions contradicted each other, but she didn't notice. Control mattered more than consistency. The clipboard stayed tucked under her arm, pen ready, like she was waiting to write someone up. Protesters exchanged looks that said, "This is getting out of hand." No one wanted to escalate, but no one felt okay either. A woman whispered that she felt uncomfortable. Another nodded, eyes fixed on Karen's gestures. The protest had gone from energized to tense in a matter of minutes. Karen interrupted another attempt to chant, raising her hand and saying people needed to pause until spacing was corrected. Pause. At a protest. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't actively derailing the event. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped when she glared at them. She repeated that HOA standards applied in shared spaces, emphasizing the word shared like it unlocked everything. She said it didn't matter that this was public property, because residents had responsibilities everywhere. Her voice climbed higher, sharper, trying to dominate the soundscape. The louder she got, the more uncomfortable everyone felt. A protester finally told her to step back and let people move. She shot back that refusal to follow direction would be noted. That phrase again. Noted. It carried a threat she couldn't actually enforce, but in the moment, it chilled the crowd. Phones tilted higher, capturing every word. She gestured broadly now, sweeping her arm across the street, trying to reorganize bodies that didn't belong to her. People shuffled reluctantly, not because they agreed but because they wanted the disruption to stop. The irony was brutal. Her attempt to impose order was creating the very disorder she claimed to prevent. Police officers at the edge of the scene finally shifted their stance. Not rushing, not alarmed, but attentive. They'd been hands-off because the protest had been peaceful. Now it was being interfered with by someone who clearly wasn't an organizer. They watched her raise her voice again, cutting over a restarted chant, issuing directions like commands. The moment tightened. Protesters fell quiet, eyes drifting toward the officers, silently asking if this was about to be addressed. Karen didn't notice the shift behind her. She was too busy asserting control, voice raised, arm outstretched, convinced she was fixing a problem only she could see. That's when officers noticed. She planted her feet like she'd finally reached the moment she'd been building toward, lifting the clipboard higher and scanning the crowd with a tight, self-satisfied nod. Her voice carried now, steady and deliberate, cutting through the lingering murmurs. She announced that if this protest continued the way it was, she would report it. She didn't specify to whom at first because she didn't think she needed to. The threat itself was supposed to be enough. That statement landed like a brick. Protesters froze, not angry yet, just stunned. Reporting the protest wasn't something anyone had expected to hear from a random woman with a clipboard. A few people laughed reflexively, the kind of laugh that slips out when something is too absurd to process, then stopped when she didn't crack a smile. She wasn't joking. Her expression stayed rigid, almost proud. She kept going, leaning into the silence she'd created. She talked about liability, dragging the word out like it carried legal magic. She said disrupted foot traffic increased risk, that blocked streets could lead to accidents, and that unregulated gatherings opened the door to problems nobody wanted. The language sounded official, but it was hollow, stitched together from phrases she'd clearly used before in very different settings. Karen claimed she was protecting the neighborhood, stressing that phrase like it justified everything she'd done. She said residents deserved peace, predictability, and safety, and that protests spilling beyond appropriate limits threatened all three. The irony hit hard. This was a permitted protest, peaceful until she stepped in, and now she was framing herself as the only thing standing between order and chaos. Protest leaders near the front turned slowly, their expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief. One of them lowered a megaphone, eyes locked on Karen like they were trying to figure out how this conversation even existed. Another organizer whispered something under their breath, shaking their head. They paused, not because they felt threatened but because the audacity needed a second to register. Karen mistook that pause for influence. She straightened her shoulders and added that continued non-compliance would force her hand. She said she'd document everything and ensure it reached the right channels. Again, no names, no specifics, just confidence. She tapped the clipboard lightly, punctuating her words, like she was sealing a deal. The crowd's mood shifted fast. Phones were fully up now, no attempt at subtlety. People whispered openly, disbelief turning into irritation. Someone muttered, "Who does she think she is?" Another shook their head and said, "This is wild." The chants were gone completely now, replaced by a tense quiet that felt heavier than noise. Karen raised her voice a little more, pushing past hesitation. She said disruption would not be tolerated and that the neighborhood had standards. That word again. Standards. It echoed wrong on a public street filled with signs about rights and voices raised for change. A protest leader finally spoke, asking who exactly she represented. Karen answered without missing a beat, saying she was an HOA board member from a nearby subdivision. That answer sucked the air out of the moment. Oh. The word rippled through the crowd like a bad joke nobody wanted to repeat. A few people scoffed. One guy laughed out loud, sharp and incredulous, then stopped when he realized she was dead serious. Protest leaders exchanged looks that said everything. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was someone completely out of her lane. Karen doubled down instead of backing off. She said proximity mattered, that neighborhoods didn't stop at arbitrary lines, and that resident oversight extended into shared spaces. The logic twisted in on itself, but she delivered it with conviction, like saying it firmly enough would make it real. Protest leaders stood there, stunned, unsure how to even respond to something so detached from reality. She pointed at the signs, the people, the street, lumping it all together as a problem she intended to solve. She claimed she was preventing escalation, even as her presence was the only thing causing it. The hypocrisy was thick, but she couldn't see it. In her mind, she was the last line of defense. Officers watched closely now, posture changed, attention locked. They didn't step in yet, but the shift was obvious. Karen noticed them watching and took it as validation instead of warning. She turned slightly, gesturing toward them as if they were back up waiting for her signal. That move drew a few gasps from the crowd. A protest leader finally said this event was permitted and being handled appropriately. Karen waved that off, saying permits didn't override community responsibility. Her voice sharpened, frustration creeping in as her control slipped. The confidence that had carried her this far started to crack at the edges. She finished her speech with a stiff nod, like she'd delivered a final verdict. Clipboard hugged to her chest, chin raised, she waited. No one applauded. No one agreed. No one moved. The crowd wasn't confused anymore. They were done pretending this was a reasonable exchange. The pause that followed wasn't awkward. It was decisive. Protest leaders didn't argue with her. They didn't debate her points. They simply turned away, refocusing on their people, silently signaling that this woman didn't matter. The crowd followed suit, eyes shifting past her, attention moving elsewhere. That quiet dismissal hit harder than shouting ever could. Her words hung in the air with nowhere to land. Whatever authority she thought she'd built collapsed under the weight of being ignored. That's when pretending she mattered stopped being an option. The officer didn't rush in or bark orders when he stepped forward, and that calm made his presence hit harder than any shouting ever could. He moved through the edge of the crowd with an easy confidence, one hand resting near his radio, posture relaxed but purposeful. The chatter around him softened almost automatically, like people sensed this moment mattered. He stopped a few feet from Karen, giving her space without backing down, eyes steady and unreadable. He didn't start with a lecture or a warning. He didn't even mention what she'd been doing. He asked one simple question, clear and direct, his voice even over the lingering noise of the street. He asked if she was organizing the protest. The way he phrased it made it sound procedural, not personal, like he was checking a box that needed a yes or no. Karen didn't hesitate. She straightened immediately, shoulders back, chin up, and answered proudly that she was an HOA board member. The confidence in her voice suggested she expected that title to explain everything. A few people nearby exchanged looks that mixed disbelief with secondhand embarrassment. Someone muttered, "No way," under their breath. The officer nodded once, slow and deliberate, like he'd heard exactly what he expected to hear. He didn't react to the title at all. He simply stated that this was a permitted public protest, approved through the proper channels. His tone stayed neutral, not condescending, not impressed. Just factual. He continued, explaining that police were responsible for managing crowd safety and movement during events like this. He gestured lightly toward the officers positioned along the street, toward the visible permit signage taped to a pole nearby. He said coordination and oversight were already in place, and that interference from outside parties wasn't needed or allowed. Then he said it plainly, without raising his voice or softening the words. HOA rules did not apply here. Not on a public street. Not during a permitted protest. Not at all. The sentence landed clean and final, like a door closing. A ripple of relief moved through the crowd. Shoulders dropped. Someone exhaled loudly. A couple protesters nodded to each other, tension easing now that someone official had finally said what everyone else was thinking. Phones stayed up, capturing the exchange, but the energy shifted from chaos to clarity. Karen didn't accept it. Her expression tightened, lips pressed into a thin line before she pushed back. She argued that neighborhoods had a right to maintain standards even during public events. She said disruption spilled into surrounding areas and that someone had to speak up for residents. Her words came faster now, stacked together like she was trying to rebuild authority that had just been dismantled. The officer listened without interrupting, hands relaxed, stance steady. When she paused, he repeated that the event was lawful and being monitored. He said she was not an organizer, not part of the permit, and not authorized to direct participants. Still calm. Still professional. Still not engaging in debate. Karen shook her head and scoffed, muttering that this was exactly how things escalated when nobody enforced rules. She gestured toward the crowd, framing them as a problem instead of people. The crowd reacted instantly, murmurs turning sharper, patience thinning. Someone whispered, "She's still going?" Another shook their head slowly, like they couldn't believe she was pushing it. The officer's posture shifted slightly, not aggressive, just firmer. He told her that continuing to interfere could result in her being removed from the area. The warning was clear, measured, and official. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of consequence. Karen argued anyway. She said she wasn't interfering, she was assisting. She claimed she was preventing issues before they happened. The confidence she'd carried earlier cracked just enough to show frustration underneath. Her voice rose a notch, sharp and defensive, trying to reclaim control. The crowd felt it tighten again, that split second where things could go one way or the other. Protest leaders watched closely. Phones angled higher. Even the other officers subtly adjusted their stance, alert now. This wasn't just weird anymore. It was crossing into defiance. The officer didn't raise his voice. He repeated that she needed to step back and stop directing people. He said it was not a request. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could. This was authority rooted in law, not confidence. Karen opened her mouth again, ready to fire back, clipboard hugged tight against her chest like armor. She looked around, searching for validation, for someone to back her up. She didn't find it. Faces were set. Eyes were steady. Nobody was on her side. She started to speak anyway, stubborn pride pushing her forward despite every signal telling her to stop. The officer held eye contact, unblinking, waiting. The pause stretched just long enough for everyone watching to understand what was about to happen. And that was the mistake. The officer didn't change his tone when he spoke again, and that steadiness carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. He told her to step back from the protest area, clearly and slowly, making sure there was no confusion about what he was asking. It wasn't aggressive and it wasn't personal. It was procedural, the kind of instruction that comes after patience runs out. The clipboard in her hands didn't move, but her posture stiffened like she just hit a wall she couldn't talk her way through. He explained the situation publicly and professionally so everyone nearby could hear. He stated that the protest was permitted, lawful, and already being monitored for safety. He said participants had the right to be there and that police were responsible for crowd management, not private individuals. His language stayed clean and neutral, not scolding, not mocking, just firm enough to close the door on the nonsense. Every sentence landed like a reset button. The effect on the crowd was immediate. Shoulders dropped. Tension drained. People who had been bracing for something ugly relaxed almost all at once. A couple protesters exchanged relieved looks, one letting out a quiet laugh that sounded more like a release than amusement. Phones stayed up, but the energy shifted. This wasn't chaos anymore. This was resolution. Karen tried to respond, opening her mouth like she was about to launch into another explanation, but the officer gently cut her off with a raised hand. He repeated the instruction to step back, this time adding that failure to comply would result in removal from the area. His voice stayed calm, but the meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't a debate and it wasn't going to drag on. Police resumed their normal monitoring posture almost immediately, spreading attention back across the crowd instead of focusing on her. That alone said a lot. The situation was already considered handled on their end. Protest leaders nodded to each other and began reorganizing chants, confidence returning now that the distraction was being dealt with. The rhythm of the event started to rebuild itself. Karen hesitated, clearly stunned that her authority claim had collapsed so fast. She looked around like she expected someone to back her up, but nobody did. Faces that had once been confused were now firm and distant. She hugged the clipboard closer to her chest, jaw tight, muttering something about rights and overreach. Nobody engaged with it. The argument had expired. Two officers stepped closer, not rushing her, not grabbing, just positioning themselves beside her with quiet efficiency. Their presence wasn't threatening, but it was final. One of them gestured toward the sidewalk away from the protest route, making the direction clear. She resisted for a beat, digging in with stubborn pride, but the crowd had already moved on emotionally. Whatever scene she'd hoped to create wasn't happening. As she was guided away, the protest restarted behind her like a switch flipping back on. Chants rose again, stronger this time, reclaiming the space she'd hijacked. Signs lifted higher. Voices synced up. The moment felt earned, like order snapping back into place once interference was removed. The contrast was striking. Karen continued muttering as she walked, complaining about standards and neighborhoods, but her words dissolved into background noise. The farther she moved from the crowd, the smaller she seemed. No one followed. No one shouted. No one argued. The lack of reaction was brutal in its own way. Being ignored hurt more than confrontation ever could. Once she crossed the edge of the protest area, the officer told her she needed to remain outside the permitted zone. He wished her a good day, tone polite but distant, and turned back toward the event without waiting for a reply. That was it. No lecture. No extra warning. Just a clean end. The crowd barely glanced her way after that. Their focus stayed on the protest, on the purpose that had brought them there in the first place. The officers resumed scanning calmly, hands relaxed, eyes alert. Everything settled into a steady groove, like the disruption had been nothing more than a brief hiccup. Karen stood off to the side for a moment, looking back like she might say something else, then thought better of it. She adjusted the clipboard under her arm and finally turned away, disappearing into the surrounding street. The space she'd occupied filled instantly with sound and motion, like she'd never been there at all. What lingered wasn't outrage or applause. It was silence. A thick, telling quiet about her removal that spoke louder than any chant pause or shouted command. The protest didn't need to acknowledge her exit. It just kept going. But the silence afterward said everything. The protest found its rhythm again almost instantly, like a song picking up right where it left off. Voices rose together, chants locking back into sync, the sound rolling down the street with renewed confidence. Whatever awkward tension had been hanging over the crowd melted away, replaced by purpose and momentum. People stepped forward without hesitation now, moving as one, feet hitting pavement in steady cadence. Signs lifted higher, cardboard edges catching the sunlight as arms stretched upward. Messages that had been interrupted minutes earlier were suddenly loud and clear again, carried by voices that sounded stronger for having been briefly silenced. Protest leaders exchanged quick nods, one of them raising a megaphone to cue the next chant, and the response came fast and unified. No confusion. No second-guessing. Just focus. Police officers settled back into their monitoring positions, posture relaxed but attentive. They scanned the crowd calmly, no longer tracking a disruption that didn't exist anymore. The energy shift was obvious. Where there had been tension and hesitation, there was now flow. The officers didn't need to say anything. Their silence matched the stability of the moment. People near the edge of the protest laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from relief rather than humor. A woman shook her head and said, "That was wild," to her friend who replied, "Yeah, but it's over now." Those words summed it up perfectly. The distraction had been dealt with and it wasn't worth any more mental space. The crowd stayed peaceful, moving forward with intention instead of irritation. Nobody shoved. Nobody argued. The chants stayed clean and steady, echoing off buildings and traffic lights. Even passers-by stopped to watch for a second, drawn in by the energy, then moved along without issue. The protest looked exactly how it was supposed to look from the start. Karen was completely gone. Not hovering nearby. Not trying to shout from the sidewalk. Not pacing with her clipboard like she was waiting for round two. Gone in the most effective way possible, which was being made irrelevant. Her absence wasn't celebrated or discussed. It simply existed and that was enough. A few people replayed the moment quietly among themselves, shaking their heads at the audacity of it all. Someone joked that they'd never look at a clipboard the same way again. Another replied, "For real, that was next level." The humor stayed light, not mean-spirited, just processing the absurdity of what they'd witnessed. The protest route stayed clear, the spacing natural again now that nobody was forcing it. People moved when they needed to, stopped when they needed to, and adjusted without being told. That organic order, the kind that comes from mutual respect instead of imposed control, filled the street. It was the exact opposite of what Karen had tried to impose. Police continued to watch, hands off, exactly as they should. No whistles. No commands. Just presence. The relationship between the crowd and the officers stayed neutral and calm, built on understanding instead of conflict. That balance mattered and everyone could feel it holding steady. Chants shifted topics, voices rising and falling in waves, each one carrying intention. The energy felt clean again, unbothered by ego or power plays. People focused on why they were there in the first place, not on the sideshow that had briefly hijacked their attention. Someone at the back started a new chant, and it spread fast, picked up by rows of voices until it filled the entire block. The sound was loud but controlled, passionate without being reckless. It was the kind of moment that reminded everyone why they'd shown up despite heat, crowds, and inconvenience. No one looked back for Karen. No one wondered what she was doing now. The protest didn't need closure beyond her removal. The best response to misplaced authority was forward motion, and that's exactly what happened. The street belonged to the people again, governed by permits, rights, and collective purpose instead of one person's imaginary rulebook. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The clipboard that had once stalled movement held zero power here and everyone knew it. As the protest continued down the route, the earlier disruption already felt like a footnote, a strange detour in an otherwise focused day. The story people would tell later wouldn't center on her tantrum. It would center on how quickly the crowd reclaimed its voice once she was gone. She tried controlling a protest crowd, and learned clipboards don't outrank the Constitution.